Hi everyone, and welcome to the Landscapes of Art and Earth. I'm your host, Shivani Gupta, and in this show we will be having conversations with artists, curators, and environmentalists who can inform us about some of the most important topics in our world today. Today we are joined by documentary filmmaker and eco-storyteller Arian Tomar, who is pursuing a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Film and Television Production at the University of Southern California. Arian has quite the resume of experience. Just to name a few endeavors, he was the social media video production intern for USC's Office of Sustainability, where he produced 51 short-form videos that reached 170,000 views over 9 months. He was an environmental communications intern for USC's Wrigley Institute for Environment and Sustainability, where he independently produced a 3-episode series that covered apocalypse narratives, coral restoration, and ancient disaster resilience. And he has directed 5 documentaries and docuseries, 2 of which won an award, and 2 of which were in the running for one. We are joined by him today in a conversation where we get to learn about how he became the filmmaker he is today, gain insights from him on the work he does, and more. Thank you for joining me, Arian.
Yeah, hey Shivani, I'm super excited to speak with you today about my creative journey.
Awesome, it's great to have you here. So let's dive in. To start off, how did you first discover your passion for the environment and environmental science?
I grew up in Minnesota, and as I think a lot of people know, our winters are pretty brutal. And at least in my family, some other families would be out like skiing or snowshoeing or doing anything to enjoy the winter, but in my family, we had no interest in any of those kind of like winter outdoor activities. That led to, a lot of like family time and, like movie watching in the winters when, it was pretty cold to go outside. But what that led to in the summers was this really big emphasis from both my parents that I get out and I enjoy nature as much as I can, particularly because, when the winter came back around, I wouldn't really get to be outside. And where I was growing up when I was younger, we had this really big backyard. It was about half an acre. And there's this really big oak tree back there that I had loved playing around. It was kind of like my giving tree, I think, when I was growing up. But yeah, I would play a lot outside when I was a kid, and I just had so much fun, like making up stories and, like pretending I was, an adventurer in foreign lands, slaying monsters and just like playing outside. And whenever it got too hot in the summers, I'd read in the shade of my family's oak tree in the backyard. I would often read about stories like Greek myths. I was a really big fan of Percy Jackson and the Olympians. But yeah, and that just kind of like really stoked my interest in mythology and the way that ancient people were able to kind of make sense of their natural world through the associations with gods and the stories of myths. And I think that a lot of that still like resonates with me now, but I'd say my initial interest came from, my exposure to the outdoors, even just in my backyard, and reading these really, fantastical stories about natural phenomena and the tragedies of all the characters involved in them. And that curiosity and interest in the environment only grew as I got older. And in school, I took a really invested interest in the sciences. Particularly because, that was where I felt most comfortable given my upbringing. And science for me still is a place where you can kind of like learn anything and find out whatever you want about the natural world. It was just a really freeing opportunity for me to just learn and to continue understanding like how the natural world that I love so much, how it works. And that, like I said, has only grown as I've gone into college and found my calling as an environmental storyteller.
That's amazing. And I feel like having, like you mentioned, your oak tree growing up, I feel like having a tree like that or an experience like that is such a memorable part of growing up, and like having a physical part of the environment that you have memories associated with, that must be so special.
Definitely, and as I got older, I would kind of like underestimate the role that trees would have in my life. And when I studied abroad in British Columbia, I was doing a lot of organizing work and storytelling work around old growth and the Fairy Creek land defense movement. And so, it's, throughout my early career, there have been a lot of those like full circle moments where, elements of my upbringing have kind of come back in my professional work. And so, yeah, that's one of the things I love about environmental storytelling, is that like it creates such personal connections that often come back in really surprising and exciting ways.
Absolutely. So to kind of go a little bit into your upbringing, being a child of immigrants, how has that impacted and inspired your journey into documentary filmmaking?
Yeah, it's been a really big inspiration for me, and in just like the way that my parents have brought me up. My dad is from North India, and my mom is from Laos. And so my dad's an immigrant. He came over in the early 2000s, but my mom's a refugee. We're actually an ethnic minority called the Hmong people, who live in northern Laos, and she was impacted by kind of the fallout of the Vietnam War. And so she fled her home in Laos in the early 80s to move to the United States, because there were some policies in place where church would sponsor these Hmong refugees for their contributions in the Vietnam War. And so my mom grew up in Minnesota for the most part. And then my dad came over eventually. So being kind of like from this mixed intercultural household, and having both the perspective of an immigrant and a refugee, someone who chose to leave their home in search of economic opportunity and for love, in the case of my dad. My mom is someone who is like forcefully pushed out of her home country. I think that's instilled me with a lot of different values. And it really inspires a lot of my work now. I think the two biggest things that I've been able to learn from my parents is honoring the sacrifice that they have both given up for me and my sisters for our life in the United States. And then the other aspect of that is service, right? And so in recognition of the sacrifice of my parents' generation and all these other immigrant parents who have given so much to their kids, right? As my family kind of like became more established in the United States, there was a really big push for us, particularly from my mom, to kind of give back to the other generation of first generation families who were in a similar position to us when we first got to the United States. And so I think the biggest thing that they've kind of taught me is like the recognition of the sacrifice that people make in the hope for creating a better community for their kids to grow up in, but then also kind of like this really big service component of giving back whenever you do have something to offer. And I think the last kind of thing that has really inspired much of my journey, kind of from my upbringing with immigrant parents, is the way that education has played a really big role in my life. For my parents, they saw education as a way to advance the family. And so when I was growing up, there was a really, really intense focus on it. Ever since I was like, in kindergarten, they told me to study hard and to learn as much as I can and to really never stop growing. And I think that's something that has, that I've continuously done throughout my entire life so far. And I think for me, it's like the biggest thing I hope to do with all that I've been able to learn is to kind of like give back and to use my education as a way to kind of like to make an impact and to turn it into action. And I think finally there's just generally, I think a culture of utility and practicality in the Midwest where I grew up, that I think resonates with a lot of immigrant parents as well. I'm personally trying to tell stories that are empowering and impactful, but are also useful and share knowledge on alternative ways of living that can create a better future. I will say though that at times it has been kind of difficult managing like an early creative career and having immigrant parents who don't have as much of an understanding of kind of like what that career path looks like. But I think that it's made me a lot stronger in my drive to succeed, because I really want to show my immediate family that it's possible to be successful creatively, and that despite all the uncertainty of my industry, that I want to tell stories more than anything else. And so it's been a gradual process, but I think they've come a long way in kind of understanding my perspective as an artist and a creator, and understanding that like for me this was like the absolute best way I could take all the lessons that they've taught me and all the sacrifice all the things they've given up for me. This is the best way I feel like I can really pay that back and pay it forward to to everyone else who's helped lift me up along the way.
That's amazing. And like, it's really like such a holistic way that you've taken the lessons that you've learned and applied them into your work and the way that you go about your work, taking lessons from every part of your upbringing, whether it's the personal experiences that you had in your backyard or the lessons that you were taught from your parents or that you observed. And so I'd love to go into the way that you go about making your films, and I'd love to learn about what is your creative process.
Sure. For me, there's kind of like two parts to every story I tell. First thing is finding a really kind of compelling protagonist for your story. And then also for me, kind of like in my interest as a documentary filmmaker and trying to maximize the impact of my films, the second thing I'm really looking for is a really good strategy that will make the documentary successful. One of my screenwriting professors gave me this working definition of story, of like what is a story that I really like. And that definition is every story is about someone who wants something and is having a hard time getting it. And so for me, I kind of break this down into two components, right? You need a protagonist who wants something. And then the other aspect that makes up a story is, the conflict. Why are they having a hard time getting it? So when I am out there researching documentary stories and trying to find people that I think could carry a story, I'm really looking for two things. I'm looking for someone taking an action. And I think what the benefit of is in telling environmental stories is that there's conflict around every corner. There's climate change, biodiversity loss, issues in outdoor equity. There's so much out there. And so for me, at least in kind of like my niche that I've selected for myself, conflict is very plentiful, right? So really that helps me narrow my focus into finding people that are trying to take some sort of environmental action, because I can kind of, at a high level, understand that there's probably some sort of deeper conflict that I can kind of tie the film to. So that's kind of like how I narrow in on my stories. And then on the second half is figuring out the strategy behind the documentary, right? And so there are a couple things that I really try to focus on in my strategy thought process. And those are producibility, impact, and reach. So the very first criteria that I'm looking for in a strategic story is that it needs to be producible, right? And then what that means basically is that with whatever resources I have, typically time, money, crew, and equipment, with the resources I have, the film needs to be within the right kind of like scale and scope to be made with all those resources. It's almost a waste of everyone's time to try and set out on a really big project if you and your participant are both really busy, right? Like it's just kind of like a non-starter. And so the biggest thing in my work, kind of like as a director producer, is to make sure that like I can actually tell the kind of story that will do it justice with kind of the resources I have. So that's the first thing I look for on producibility. The second thing is impact, right? I really want to maximize impact by partnering with documentary participants who are doing the best quality work for their community, and who kind of understand at least a little bit kind of the value that they provide, so that they can better share it on screen. And then finally, the more connected my documentary participants are, the better I feel about their story kind of reaching the most people possible. A lot of times as an independent, like short documentary filmmaker, you really don't have access to well-resourced distribution platforms. And so really you're kind of relying on your connections and who you know and who your participants know in order to share that story, right? And that isn't to say like, less connected organizations are less interesting to me. It just will change kind of the way that I approach either structuring their story or telling their story, just so that it's more easily shareable, right? Like let's say, for example, I'm working with a really big local organization in Los Angeles that has a lot of connections and has people that want to see this story told. I might be more comfortable in that circumstance making something longer form that asks more of its audience to engage with it than, say, a really small startup with not a lot of attention so far, right? For that organization that I'd like to partner with, more short form, really small, like low barrier to entry stories might be more impactful for them in the long run. And I've seen this in my own experience making like longer short films, and sometimes they do well, sometimes they do better, sometimes they don't do as well, but generally, it just kind of depends on like how much that partner organization has connections with a larger community. So between those three kind of like main buckets of strategic thinking, between the producibility, maximizing my impact, and maximizing reach, that's kind of how I can like narrow in on a story that is fitting for me, because I'm a firm believer in documentary being one of the most free genres of film that you can create, just because like every single day there's some amazing story, nonfiction story that happens out there that are just waiting to be uncovered. But for me in my work as an environmental storyteller for impact, I try to kind of narrow my focus even more so, because let's say, for example, I know for a fact in LA County there are hundreds of really awesome people engaging in environmental action, but not all of them are looking to tell their own story. Not all of them have, not all of them are aware of the impact that they could have. And so for me, in this structure and thought process, it just helps me more quickly sort through who I think would be a good fit for my storytelling capabilities.
I see. And in that, like, like, research process, do you kind of like talk to different organizations to like understand where they stand during that process?
Yeah, we call it development, which is kind of like where you're figuring out what the story is, who you might have access to, who you get along with, and kind of what other resource, and you're kind of exploring what you can do with the resources you have. And so honestly, development for me can be anywhere from like 1 or 2 conversations with someone to months of interviewing with a potential subject. It just kind of depends on, again, the scope of the documentary and kind of the resources I have access to. But yeah, most of the time it's research that I conduct, and then also kind of making initial contact with potential documentary participants and kind of getting to know their world, because as a storyteller, it's kind of my job to take whatever specific perspective they have in their community and make it accessible for people who have, to strangers essentially. And basically I need to be as much an expert on their perspective as they are. So that way I can do it proper justice and really like open up their small sustainability world to, a larger audience of people.
And to kind of like, because a lot of your work is like kind of like the thought process of people, like whether it's like who you're interviewing or your audience and how they're thinking. And let me know if I'm putting words in your mouth, but to kind of like whether it's to influence who you're bringing your stories to, or to tell them a story. So it's kind of like about being able to understand both who you're interviewing and your audience on a deeper level.
Definitely, yeah. And it's really all like, I don't think there's necessarily like a bad way. Like there are definitely like better ways to approach documentary filmmaking, but like I think for me, as long as you are approaching with the intent to understand and to also figure out strategically how the film can also give something to your participants, I think as long as you have that approach and that intention in mind, like there's no bad way to like really make a documentary film. So yeah, I think you summarized it really well.
Thank you. I wanted to ask, just kind of looking at your work and having done a lot of work in British Columbia and then now being in Los Angeles, is Los Angeles a place that you want to continue to work in and that you want to work in long term, or geographically, what parts of the world would you like to cover?
Yeah, I think for now, I see the beginning of my creative career in Southern California, just because I think I've built up a lot of good connections here and a lot of like, I have a creative community. There's a lot of momentum I've built up in my work experience that would kind of like keep me here. And that's really exciting. But at the same time, I wouldn't mind traveling for work to cover more international collaboration efforts, particularly in South and Southeast Asia, where my parents are from. I think it's, I'm not opposed to international travel, but at least, for the next 10 years or so, I'd like to stick around the United States, just continuing to build my creative connections, Because I think for me, just like as a U.S. citizen, I think I have the most pull in my home country. And I think that's where I have the most influence. So I'd like to kind of maximize that as much as I can. But yeah, like you said, I studied abroad in British Columbia, and since that time where I was studying there, I really can't see myself, parting from the Pacific Ocean unless it's for a really good reason. Growing up somewhere landlocked in Minnesota, even though we have plenty of fresh water, at times it felt kind of like constraining. But since I've been on the coast for the last 4 years or so, I think it's been just a really good learning opportunity and a way to experience a different way of life, like along the ocean, that I've really enjoyed. And so I definitely see myself sticking around at least the Pacific Ocean, the Pacific Coast, as much as possible. But yeah, I have no idea what life has in store for me and the rest of my career. Because I don't think there's any shortage of powerful sustainability stories to be told anywhere in the world.
Absolutely, and it's integrated in every part of our life. So, and there's more, we see more of them every single day. So, since you began filmmaking, you've made a variety of different films. Has your storytelling focus shifted since you started this journey?
Yeah, for the last couple of years, I've kind of just been working on anything I can to build my filmmaking and storytelling skills. But now that I've gotten a bit more established in my college experience, and as I'm starting to kind of think about transitioning out of college, I think I've become just naturally more selective in the projects I work on. And I think this is like a pretty like normal progression to take for any creator. But now that I'm entering like my 5th year of filmmaking experience, I've really seen like where I could be more effective in my documentary filmmaking. And for me, that means taking a more long-term look at kind of opportunities possible in any kind of potential story universe. For example, like I'm no longer interested in like grinding out short documentaries that are just trying to like get my name out there. And I'm instead trying to build longer term relationships with my participants so that I can more thoroughly explore the stories that they provide access to. Oftentimes I think that particularly at the School of Cinematic Arts, I've found that there's kind of like this push to just like do a high volume of work just to kind of like, one, to get practice, but also to like build your reel and make it as big as possible. And I've done that for the last 2 years or so, but now that I'm, like I said, more established and I'm getting more frequent work opportunities, I don't really feel the need to like push as hard. I also hope to provide a more future forward perspective in the stories I tell going forward. I think beyond uplifting new sustainability solutions, I hope to provide a look into ways of living that I believe can prevent the next global resource crisis. Personally, I'm concerned that even if humanity can move past our reliance on fossil fuels, unchecked greed, inequity, and exploitation will lead to new conflicts over finite resources. Whether it's lithium or fresh water or agricultural products, regardless of what becomes the kind of new object of desire that fuels widespread conflict, I strongly advocate for a fossil-free future, but like I cannot guarantee that like our future will be any less fraught with suffering than it currently is. Like I don't want to exchange fossil fuels for another finite resource that we continue to be divided over. But I think for me the solution I found is to uplift alternative ways of being that reduce our reliance on a system of economic exploitation, and instead increase support within community. And I think the way I want to do that through nonfiction, I think, is particularly powerful. Just because I personally believe that, like, in creating this new world, a world without fossil fuels, a world without climate change, I'm deeply concerned about what that future looks like. But I also think that, in the present day, there's a lot that we can learn from, really inspiring community leaders that show us that in that new world we're creating, there is still some good in the old world worth taking forward. And again, through nonfiction, right? Like every story I tell is true, and I try to keep it as authentic to my participants' experience as possible. And so I think that like through my approach, I'm showing that like a better future is possible, a fossil-free future is possible, and that these are all stories that are happening right now. Just as a way to inspire more tangible hope and inspire people to take action together in ways that are sustainable for generations to come. And yeah, I think that's definitely something I'd like to focus more on. Continue to shift my work towards focusing on in the future. Just as I continue to learn more about kind of like how long-term change is made and what that better future looks like. This is definitely something that I think I'd like to incorporate more into my work.
And that's such an important point of view and topic that you're bringing out into the world, because especially like with it being nonfiction work, like there's already a lot of people who don't believe in what's happening in the environment, and um showing them these true stories of real people that are making forward-thinking change in the world. um it's it's like these are real people, and like this is really happening, and like we can learn from these people. And there's there's so many emotions that come with all the environmental changes that are happening, and just giving people a look into um a potentially positive future, or people who are working into a positive working towards making the future more positive is that is so important. And I'd love to ask you and go into, when you make your films, who do you think about seeing your films? Who is your target audience?
Yeah, definitely. I think the question of audience is a really important one, because at least from what I've seen in my study of like film history is that oftentimes like there are really like inventive and promising films that have released across time but just haven't found the right audience. But as time progresses and as we preserve film history, they find new audiences in modern times, for example. And so I think like in that study, what I've been able to identify is that like audience matters as much as the content itself. And so for me, I've thought a lot about this, and I think that for me, my target audience is any aspiring change maker, located at least somewhere close to the communities featured in my stories. And I think that if you're curious about learning more about the world around you and have at least a basic understanding of environmental issues, and you want to get involved, then you're probably part of my target audience, I'd say.
Awesome. And amongst your audience and the people who view your work, have you noticed any patterns about their knowledge and engagement with sustainability and the environment?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think for me, my audience has demonstrated an interest, awareness, and concern about environmental issues, which I think allows them to more personally engage with my work. That isn't to say that I don't make films for people who are less interested in environmental issues. And I think there's tremendous artistry in finding a way to make, an issue as big as climate change accessible to people who, may not fully believe in it, or who are just, only cautious of it rather than being concerned of it. And I think at least where I'm at right now in my creative journey, I am not focusing my attention on those audiences who are more climate skeptical, let's say. But I definitely think that there's, it's a really significant challenge, and it's one that I look forward to confronting in my later career. But yeah, definitely right now, everyone who's watching my films, at least have, some awareness of environmental issues. They can acknowledge that climate change is real. And I think it allows them to kind of engage with my films at a level that so that they can think about what lessons they want to learn from the protagonists in my stories, and my audience is I think particularly interested in how they can replicate the success that they see on screen, and take these lessons that they learn from my films into their own lives. And I think that's really important for me, and is continues to be an inspiring force in my work.
I see. So it's like the organizations, for example, that you're showing in your films, it's like a way of giving them light, but also a way of giving the processes in their work light as a way to be like, this is what people are doing and you can be involved in this too.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why speaking about my target audience, I think a lot about location and just kind of like and place, because I think it's really important to uplift like local organizations that, people around Los Angeles can go and interact with. But at the same time, because I still have, a lot of community in Minnesota, for example, I want to tell stories that even if you can't, support the organization I'm highlighting in person, maybe there's ways that you can engage with their mission online, or there are just simply lessons that you can take and kind of apply to other community organizations wherever you're located. And so it's kind of like it's a call to action to increase engagement with local organizations, but it's also a way to disseminate the knowledge that they've generated for people who aren't able to connect in person.
I see. Awesome. Given the many projects that you've worked on in your career, which project or projects have been the most impactful for you personally?
Yeah, I think it's something that I reflect on kind of around this time every year, just as 2024 just ended, and I did a lot of great work then, and I'm just kind of thinking about like what would I like to do more of in 2025. And kind of like in that period of reflection, the project that I found to be most impactful for me personally, at least in the last year, has been my short documentary about Cottonwood Urban Farm. The story itself is just really touching and personal to me as someone who has greatly benefited from the kind of community support that, like Cottonwood offers. And in my 3 years of living in LA, I haven't really found a group of people who have the same kind of kindness, warmth, and openness that that I found at the Cottonwood kind of community. It really reminds me of the kind of the service and education communities that I was a part of in Minnesota. And I'm really happy that I got to make this even really short project with them to uplift the farm story so far. And I think what excites me about this project as well is that we've been able to form a longer term partnership between me and the farm for at least the next year, as I've received a really special grant from the USC Center for Sustainability Solutions to continue storytelling with the farm to help capture their community impact. And I think this is a really exciting opportunity for me to kind of deepen my connection with a community that I admire, who is taking environmental action together and trying to educate as many people as possible, and to also continue to do great work that helps more people engage with the farm and share all the lessons they've learned over the years. So for me, like Cottonwood has been the most impactful personally, just because it reminds me of home a little bit. But also it is emblematic of that new style and the new approach I want to take in my work, which focuses less on short-term film success, let's say, and is more interested in long-term community engagement for, larger impact.
And if you haven't seen it yet and you're watching this podcast, go watch the documentary. It's incredible. So you're currently working on quite a few projects, and involved in a few different areas, one of them being the Hayes Barnard Sustainability Fellowship at USC. Do you work in other mediums or projects other than photo and video? And could you tell us a little bit more about your work in this fellowship?
Definitely. Right now, the fellowship mostly focuses on bringing together an interdisciplinary cohort of students, so that way we can kind of learn from one another while we develop ourselves as sustainability leaders. Together, we take courses on business leadership, sustainability systems, climate change, and it kind of the program experience culminates in a final internship with organizations who align with our sustainability and academic interests. Our cohort runs the gamut of academic interests, from film production with me to geographic information systems and data science to architecture and business. And so what I've really benefited from in this cohort so far is just the opportunity to have dedicated time with one another, to learn from each other's experiences, and to kind of see new perspectives from which we can approach sustainability challenges. I really look forward to the variety of collaborative opportunities we will get to work together over our 2 fellowship years. We're opening up applications for the second cohort of the fellowship soon. So if you're listening to this or watching this and you're a sophomore at USC, If this sounds interesting to you, please keep your eyes out for that application opportunity, and feel free to connect with me to hear more about the fellowship. So currently, I'd say that we're really focused on education. But then, I think with the internship, and we might have a travel service opportunity as well in the future, there are definitely ways that I can kind of contribute to this cohort beyond photo and video, particularly just with my background in entrepreneurship, and the way that I've kind of been able to manage a creative career. I think that I've learned a lot of skills in those two areas that I think I can bring to the discussion. But for the most part, like if I'm ever doing anything with the fellowship, it will probably be through my main interest in documentary filmmaking. But yeah, it's a really cool opportunity to kind of like come back to this cohort learning model that I really benefited from in British Columbia and in Minnesota, and to just kind of like use my own experience to kind of help show my cohort other ways of communicating that they may not be aware of. And that's been something that's really important and special to me.
That's awesome. And it sounds like the experience is like tying in a few of a few of your interests and values, whether it's education or working with people who may be thinking about forward thinking projects, or working in different mediums. And I also wanted to ask you, in terms of how you integrate your lifestyle and your work, are there any habits or parts of your lifestyle outside of your work that greatly contribute to your inspiration or your practice?
Yeah, I think right now the biggest practice that contributes to my work is making time to remind myself kind of like why I do the work in the first place. In all kind of fields of environmental action, it can feel like all that matters is the work we do. But I found that by taking breaks to be with friends and experience awe in nature, I'm a much more effective communicator and student of environmental issues, and particularly it really benefits my work as a documentary filmmaker. In the kind of the youth grind culture that we're seeing more often, I think it's been instrumental for me to stay connected and aware of why I'm doing this work so that I can continue making a difference. I think it'd be really easy to kind of like, work super hard on my storytelling and make that my only focus. But I found that like when I've done that in the past, like it leads to a lot of burnout, and you almost start to become cynical about if you're making a difference or not. And I just don't find those thoughts to be helpful. So for me, it's been much more, I found a lot more success in just kind of taking a more sustainable approach to my work and understanding that like I need a life outside of it to, give the value, to give the work that I do more value. And so even if I may not see the results of my work for years to come, I can at least, take pride in seeing, in growing the creative community around me, which I think is just as much of a motivator as, the outcomes of all the work I'm doing. And I think another thing that helps me stay balanced is to spend time, just not being a filmmaker at all. I found more and more that, I'm so attached to my work that I often forget that, I'm not just a filmmaker. I'm an educator, I'm a mentor, I'm an older brother, I'm a photography enthusiast, I'm just a human being. And so whenever, I'm working on a project, I'm spending long nights editing or working on sound design on a project that I'm not even sure that people will watch, it feels like I take it incredibly personally. But by getting some distance from my work and, just going on a hike, taking some photos and trying not to be so impactful all the time, I think it allows me to return to my work with a new perspective that makes it easier to get through some of the more grindy parts of filmmaking.
Absolutely. And I feel like as an artist, it's so important to as an artist, I sometimes see it as you're a vehicle for sharing stories, and it's so important to be taking care of that vehicle, and to be experiencing life so that you can, as you said, bring those new perspectives into your work. And that's amazing. What advice would you give to people who want to go into environmental filmmaking?
Yeah, I think that's a really big question. and I think it's something that I've been thinking a lot about recently as well, just because it's like I've been making films for 4 years, going to my 5th year of like doing it all the time, basically. And I think about kind of what advice would I have wanted to hear when I was just getting started and, had no idea what was coming in my creative journey. And I'd say that for any aspiring environmental storytellers, I really encourage you to think about who you are and who you want to be when you aren't working. And I think this really builds on, the answer I gave to the last question, but in film, when you're just getting started, there's going to be like a lot of downtime between projects where you may not have a story to tell. And definitely like once you become a more structured filmmaker and like say, for example, you're working with crews and, you're not doing every single role yourself, you may not always have like as much of a leadership position as you once did when you were just getting started. But at the same time, I want to remind you that like your utility does not necessarily come from your labor or what you can do for other people, but it comes from your own kind of well of creativity. So I'd encourage you to find a way to stay creative and inspired even when you aren't working. And I found that, doing this, finding a way to just something else to do in the meantime to stay creative, it helps keep me busy when I'm not working. And also just like kind of mentally refreshes me so that when I do start working again, I can return with new ideas and connections that, keep me inspired in my work and kind of reduce how stagnant it feels. And I'd say that like film might be your passion, particularly right now. But I'm really confident that there's more to you than just that. So take my question into consideration and really think about who you want to be when you aren't working. I think that's the biggest kind of guiding question I could offer an aspiring environmental storyteller or filmmaker.
Thank you. And what would you say is your dream job or work?
Yeah, I think it's really hard because like I'm trying to advocate for the end of having to work to survive. But I think recently I've been able to clarify my storytelling interests in a way that I hope can get me a job in about a year's time. And recently, I think that's been potentially a career in research communication and storytelling. Like I spoke about earlier, for me, education has been a really important aspect of my life. Like I love learning. I hope to be a lifelong learner. And I think for me, like every time I've learned something, it's the more and more I learn, the more I want to put it into practice, right? Like I want to take what I've learned and then do something with it, right? To turn education into action. And so recently I've been thinking about like, how could I do that for like a job? And I think I've settled on research communications because I think at least for me at a research institute like USC, the highest form of like mastery over your education is to generate new knowledge, right? And to really put it into action. And I think at least with the research projects that I've been aware of at USC, they've been really, really impactful and have inspired me to want to take more of an interest in uplifting the work that our researchers are doing. For example, this past fall, I had the opportunity to work with USC Sea Grant, which is within the Wrigley Institute for Environment and Sustainability. And I was working with them to tell a research story about a selective kelp breeding initiative in collaboration with the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. And I won't bore you with the details, but it was a really complex science story to tell about our research team on how they were able to breed naturally non-reproductive kelp, basically sterile kelp, and to advocate and educate about all the benefits of improved kelp in domestic farming initiatives. Basically, kelp has tons of uses in agricultural, cosmetic, pharmaceutical, and nutritional industries. But at least for me, what's super interesting about kelp is that it can also be used to potentially create bioplastics and biofuel, both of which may be necessary in the transition away from fossil fuels. So being able to tell that story and at least get a taste of what research storytelling can look like, I thought was just like a really great opportunity that showed me how much more impact I could have in the future if I kept down this path. So yeah, I'd say currently the closest I'm going to get to a dream job might be research storytelling, particularly around environmental innovation and new emerging technologies that make sustainability at scale more possible for more people.
Amazing. And my last question is, Are there any future or upcoming projects that you are looking forward to?
Yeah, I think for me right now, my work with Cottonwood Urban Farm is kind of the biggest focus I have. But I also may be doing more kind of educational storytelling around kelp later this year, and that's really exciting to me too. But yeah, right now I'm just kind of focused on being a student, graduating on time, and working with Cottonwood whenever I can, to continue capturing the impact that they have in their community. But yeah, I'd say like that's probably gonna keep me busy for most of 2025, and after that, who knows what'll happen.
Amazing. Well, this was an incredibly insightful and wonderful conversation, Arian. I had a great time, and thank you so much for your time. If listeners want to view your films or learn more about your work, where can they find you?
Yeah, I'll share the link with everyone, but you guys can go check out my website. It's just my name, ariantomar.com. And if you want to watch any of the stuff that I talked about, whether it's my Sea Grant Kelp video or my Cottonwood short documentary, or to go look back through the past work I've done with the Wrigley Institute or the Office of Sustainability, you can check out my portfolio page on my website. And that has all kind of the links and some more behind the scenes stories of kind of like how those projects came to be. So if you want to watch all my stuff, go to my website. But if you are an aspiring storyteller, a film student, just someone interested in the work I do and you want to connect with me, my email is on my website, but also I'd recommend following me on Instagram and just sending me a message. I try to keep myself as accessible as possible. So don't be shy, get in touch, and I'd be more than honored if you wanted to check out my work.
Thank you. And what is your Instagram handle?
It's just Arian Tomar, the future.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Arian, and thank you all for coming into this podcast and for listening. Make sure to comment if you have any thoughts or any questions. This will be available on Spotify and on YouTube. And if you have any thoughts or questions that you want to directly email to me, you can reach out to me at shivanigupta416@gmail.com. That's it for now, and we will see you next time on the Landscapes of Art and Earth.